Well, I guess let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to our Barbaric Bestiary panel here, talking to some Robert E. Howard. And my name's Kyle Mitchell. I am the second director for the media track and also second director for the lit part of the lit art and comics track this year. And I just came to know Robert E. Howard's writings. I don't know how I missed it. I just didn't. Until recently, last year, and dove right in. I'm super excited to do a panel here and learn even more which stories I need to read and so forth. But fitting in Monsterama, I figured we would talk about some of the monsters from some of the best stories, and then wherever the conversation goes from there, you know, whatever y'all want to talk about as well, we will do. So let's meet our panelists. Down at the end there. Start us off.
I'm Bobby Nash. I write all kinds of stuff. I have written monsters and fantasy stuff and spy stuff and crime fiction and a little this, a little that. As a writer, I'm basically a whore. Publisher goes, I need this. You pay it? Yep, great. It's the gig. But yeah, I love monster stuff, and we were talking a little bit about this before. I'm a big fan of discovering lost worlds and or new discoveries of places like that. So the monster stuff holds a big place in my heart because of that.
I'm Dwayne Todd. I'm just a huge Robert E. Howard fan. I would not say I'm a scholar because I've met a lot of scholars. They have a Howard Days every year in Cross Plains, Texas, where he lived, and you can see some. Yeah, there you go. Nice ad. And but I'll say that I started reading Howard stuff when I was about 15, and I believe I own pretty much anything he wrote. I don't have a shelf. I have an entire bookcase.
Wow.
It's nothing but Howard, and it's one of like all of us, we have a lot of books we've never read. Or at least I do. I have a whole collection of these things that. But I pretty much anything that's on that shelf I've read, because I just I eat up Howard stuff. Whether it's boxing, action, monsters, and certainly the monster stuff is what pulled me in early on when I was an avid D&D player and discovered this world of this amazing world of Conan and the other sword and sorcery stuff. So I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it was probably, Conan would have been the first thing I think I read of Howard's, because I remember we moved, when I was 12 years old, we moved, and so I am in this new school, and we moved, the school year had already started, so I'm there, I know next to no people, like I met a few people first who were into comics and stuff, so I was like, cool, my people. But the library at this new school we went to, the librarian was a big geek, and she made sure that the Conan paperbacks were there for us to check out, a bunch of the stuff like that, a lot of Burroughs stuff, a lot of good science fiction and stuff that they're like, teenage boys will love this. It'll get them reading. And so I read a lot of Conan. That's how I discovered Conan, because this was before they'd done the movie. So this was my first introduction to this, and I was just blown away by those beautiful covers, those beautiful covers between all the monsters and fighting giant snakes in one hand. Yeah, as a teenage boy, it's like catnip, it's like ooh, And so that was my first introduction to Howard, and then it would be years later before I would realize he wrote a lot of other stuff and would start, picking at it that way.
Yeah, I had read some of the comics as a kid, and of course saw the Schwarzenegger, Conan movies, and so forth. But I had never heard of Solomon Kane. I'd heard of Conqueror. I'd seen some of the comic books as well and the movie, and but had never read any of the stories until talking about D&D getting people in. Right? It's great. I love, because I'm a big board game geek, and I love anything games and how games is then. Bringing people into literature, and that's what got me here, was the Solomon Kane board game, getting me into. And here's some of the art from a beautiful art book that came along with those people that kickstarted it, right?
Yeah.
You backed it, right?
Yeah. The people running the campaign were at Howard Days, and they were running a demo, but they had the art, and hearing them talk about it, I was like, here's my money. But they created a board game with modules, and each of the modules represents one of the stories of Solomon Kane, and it has dynamics that are going on that emulate how the story evolves, and it can go a lot of different directions. And I'm a miniatures person.
Yeah.
I used to do miniatures gaming, so they have just incredibly detailed miniatures. They're beautiful. I mean, just awesome sculpts of every little nuanced character and the kid who was going by and stuff like that.
Well, and in the game, you play the virtues inside of Solomon Kane.
Yeah.
So when it's your turn, you are always kind of controlling Solomon Kane or influencing him from one of the many virtues, providence or judgment or whatever they are, all are you. And so I thought that was a really clever way to do it, because the Solomon Kane stories are so internal, that his internal demons fighting with them almost as much as the external demons, and so they're fighting.
Yeah.
So that's what got me into it. But we don't have to start with Solomon Kane. Do you have any favorites?
Favorite stories? Or
Robert E. Howard?
Well,
not to put you on the spot. But
Well, I was sitting here thinking as Bobby was talking about his early experience. Maybe my early experience is amusing. Let's see, maybe 1990, I was at a thrift store, saw a stack of these books.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was the appeal of the whole collection of Howard for next to nothing, but I didn't read them for years, because all I knew was this Schwarzenegger Conan movie that I hadn't even seen, but I thought looked kind of dumb. Muscular, tough guy, barbarian. I thought, whatever. I mean, but then I finally sat down and started to read them, and I was amazed at this is completely different. I mean, what do you say? The prose, the flow of the words and the sequences.
And I went from there, after reading a Conan novel, that's when I discovered that Marvel was doing the comics, and I really got into those. Roy Thomas wrote some beautiful Conan stories, and just such good stuff. So I actually read more of the comics before I read more of the novels, and good stuff.
I really, really love the early comics. But Roy Thomas was very passionate about Howard. He wanted to be accurate. He wanted to be thorough. He dug into the Howard stories and tried to bring that spirit.
Yeah, and he convinced Marvel to do it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a few years later, when you get up into some of the later issues, he becomes a stereotype. He's just very, he's just this raw barbarian that muscles his way through all the story. The stories. He's the strongest, baddest dude around. And what I love about Howard's stories, and I think this starts to touch on some of the monster stuff, is often Conan is not the main character in the action. There's all this stuff going on, and Conan is like he's a part of it, but he's a witness to all these incredible things, and he gets by, and escapes. But he's not like hacking his way through the story.
Yeah.
I think the Schwarzenegger movie kind of changed it, because in the books he was not this overly muscular guy. Like, I think in terms of the look, the Jason Momoa look, he looked more like Conan from the books than Schwarzenegger did. But once that movie came out and was popular, that suddenly became what everybody thought Conan was. And the book covers even started changing to reflect him. So he got bigger and more muscular, and.
But I remember so many of the short stories. It was eye-opening to me, because my only perception was this perception of these Conan movies I hadn't even seen, where I just feel like I was a big dumb brute, passionate, slacking, and slacking. I'm not sure. But anyhow,
Hack and slash.
Yeah. But in the short stories, I feel like I remember so many where he's got to get a jewel or something, steal it, except it's guarded by some demon, and he's flat out admits, I don't want anything to do with this demon. Let's find some way around it and get it. And to me, that is so much depth that he's okay with attacking people, then doesn't want to mess with all
Well, he
the
also seems a little
supernatural.
smarter in the books.
Yes, yes,
Than they
yes.
portray him in the movies.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I like that too about really all of Howard's characters, and that Bran Mak Morn as well. So those stories where you find like there's some planning ahead to avoid the magical consequences against you. And I didn't expect that. I really didn't. I expected more of the hack and slash or just dive right in and like Solomon Kane being so physical and dexterous and so forth, and to go in there and but it's not all that. It's also brains and reason and some scheming about how he can get out of this situation alive. And I love that about Howard's characters.
And I think and without jumping ahead a little bit, but prime monsters, Bestiary, right? Conan, for me, because when we were talking about doing this panel, I was like, let's see, just what scenes and monsters come to mind? Scarlet Citadel, Conan story, all right? And again, I don't want to rehash, but at the very beginning, Conan is completely defeated. His entire armies are defeated. The sorcerer knocks him out, throws him in the Hall of Horrors dungeon, and inside that dungeon, he encounters, first it's this huge 80-foot snake, Safa, this ancient snake. He doesn't fight the snake. He doesn't defeat the snake. He can't. He's like, I need to get the hell away from this thing. There's another guy, I don't want to, I will spoil it, but the other guy comes in, he's going to kill Conan, and the snake grabs him and kills him. And then Conan's like sneaking around, so there's this awesome, ancient evil snake. So then he moves on, and maybe you've got some. He moves on, and he finds that from that physical horror, and at this point Howard has been influenced by Lovecraft, as most writers of that time have been. He goes in and he finds this pit, and he doesn't know where the pit goes, but this presence is floating up. And he just knows this is like pure evil presence, and he needs to get away from it. And almost in terror, he's like backing away, and it's like this mind-destroying presence that's there, and he's trying to get away from that. It follows up, and it's just like a D&D thing. If I didn't know better, I didn't think Howard was sitting there playing a D&D adventure, because he's like going down this dungeon, and then he encounters the plant thing, this plant life that's got this old wizard, and it's a really erotic scene. It's got this old wizard, the flower of this plant is like right on the wizard's face, and it's like huffing stuff into it, and then like the plant is like seething in ecstasy as it sucks his dreams out. Conan chops the plant, wakes up this wizard. He's like one of the most powerful wizards around. And then the adventure begins as that wizard is in combat with the other wizard. And Conan's, again, he's kind of the side runner for this in the Scarlet Citadel, and needs to get his kingdom back. But man, just this great, just one way, and Howard's packing it into 30 pages.
Yes.
And it's like in his description, these monsters are, the creatures are alive. I mean, they're strong, and it's innovative. So anyway, that's one of those that.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the great things about the pulp era, and I certainly consider him part of that. Is that these guys didn't screw around. They told the story. There was none of this. We're gonna take a break and go think about his feelings for a bit, or go whine about the problem, or because a lot of times when you write modern contemporary novels, there are a lot of side trips that take away from the main story. And those pulp guys, they didn't bother that. It's like straight through, tell the story, don't hold back, because people were reading these things quick too.
Yeah.
That was another important thing. These were books that people were reading. Working class people mostly were reading these on the train to work and on the train home. And they were quick reads that they could put in their back pocket when they were done. And when they were finished with them, they threw them away. you know.
You mean the like Weird Tales magazines?
Well, they had
Is
Weird
that-
Tale magazines too, yeah, but those were a little bigger. Those were the slicks were a little nicer, yeah.
Oh.
You know, but once they got into the paperback era, you know, it was throwaway material.
Really?
No one, yeah, because the magazines were considered, the magazines paid better.
Mhm.
You got paid better to work in the magazines. The magazines, it's weird. The magazines of those days were the things that people thought would be collectibles, and they, to a point, are, but they didn't become as collectible as the paperbacks. But the paperbacks were considered throwaway material because, then especially once the war started,
Mhm.
you know, recycle that paperback in, and so that's why they're so rare, because there's so few of them, because people weren't saving them like they were the magazines.
Yeah.
But you made more working for the magazines. You had a little more time to work on them. The pulp the pulp books, the pulp novels, there's stories where like these guys would get on Friday a call from their editor and says, I need a novel by Monday. And these are guys typing it out on typewriters, you know, and they would pop out a story, and on Monday they turned it in, collect their $100, and, you know, I could live for a month or two, you know.
And it was interesting at the Robert E. Howard Museum that they've got a binder of all of his stories in chronological order being sold.
Yeah.
And how much money he made on each one. So you can see year by year how much money, and increasing for the most part. I think he may have one dip year, but for the most part, every year kind of making more and more money as his popularity grew and getting more contracts and stuff.
Because they didn't get paid a lot. That's why so many.
No.
That's why there are so many of the pulp characters that have house names, like Doc Savage has written up. You know, it's not a real person's name. It's a house name because they had multiple writers.
Oh,
write it.
the Kenneth Robeson?
Kenneth Robeson. It's not.
Yeah. So that's not a person.
It's not a real person.
Oh.
Yeah. What else is for the audience? The audience wanted the audience to think these are all written by the same person. But what they would do is they would form it out, and you know, guys like Howard who had a name, their own name, publishers would believe, well, if you put out 10 books a year, nobody's going to buy all of it. That's too much. But Howard's like, I got to eat, you know, and so let me write a Doc Savage book, you know, and it's under. So there's a lot of those books that they have no idea who actually wrote which book, because a lot of those records are lost to time.
Wow.
There's a character that I work on called Domino Lady, who's a pulp character from 1936. She appeared in 6 stories, and they're credited to Lars Anderson. No one knows who Lars Anderson is, or they know it's not a real person. They don't know who wrote those stories. Today, they have no idea who wrote those stories. All of those records are lost to time, and we have no idea who the actual author of them all is. And it very well could have been a famous writer doing this because this will pay my rent this month.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then wasn't the first, because Conan was the last of his characters that he created, from what I understand, of the major characters, right?
So it's like as an ongoing, you know, like a series of adventures. But other than, you know, some of the non-fantasy, because he was having trouble getting paid from Weird Tales. They I mean, Howard's pretty blunt. I write for money. If you can't pay me, I'm not going to write.
Right.
So he did shift over and did a lot of boxing stories. So Steve Costigan, who's a boxer, and he did some of the Breckenridge Elkins, which is like kind of like Will Abner. He's a wild man, but they're humorous stories from Tennessee. But there were some characters that he was working on, but primarily because he couldn't get. They had a huge backlog of money they owed him, and his mom was very sick. He needed. I mean, there's one of the letters he writes to the editor. He's like, "My mom, I have medical bills I cannot pay because you owe me over $1,000, and I need to, you know, something." And they did send him some money, and then, yeah, that really caused him to branch out a lot.
And that just proves that the publishing industry has not changed much.
They actually pay the same rates.
and they don't pay them on time.
But let's dig into some of your favorite of the monsters.
Okay. Hey, I went back and was rereading some of these. So what I tried to do is like from memory, what do we got here? And I noticed we both had Rattle of Bones.
Yes.
So, for me, Rattle of Bones, a Solomon Kane story.
Sure.
This is frickin' the ultimate Howard motif. It's 7 pages long. There's 4 characters. Okay, there's Solomon Kane, who does nothing in this story, right? And there's 3 bad guys. Well, maybe 3. There's 2 really bad guys, and it's one you don't really know about. But if you're not familiar with the story, and I hate to just overly repeat this, Solomon Kane meets a traveler in the woods. He comes up to a tavern. We're going to stay in this tavern. The name of the tavern is the Cleft Skull. All right, and he's like, that seems kind of ominous. And he goes in, and the innkeeper comes out. And he's like, do you get a lot of guests here? And the innkeeper's like, well, very few people come twice.
Yeah.
And again, Solomon Kane's like, man, this seems really ominous. What a weird response, right? So the 2 of them go, the traveler and him. They go and they get into their room and they figure out that they can't lock the door. So then they decide to wander around. Well, as it turns out, I don't think it's going to be a big surprise. The innkeeper kills the guests. Well, not only that, the traveling companion happens to be Gaston the Butcher, who's been murdering people too. So he turns on Kane. Kane, gets caught unawares. One right after another. And it all gets resolved, even though Kane doesn't do anything. And it turns
He just stays alive.
He just stays alive, and they find a person who's been chained up, who was who was a Russian wizard, and who swore, "I'm going to come back and kill you," to the innkeeper. He's had
chained him in this in the wall or closet or something like that until he just starved to death and died, and now he's just bones still chained up.
And Gaston is like, he like scoffs at it and he chops the chain. Okay, for a lot of foreshadowing here. He chops the chain and Kane's like, I don't know, it's not a good idea to disturb the dead. And, it's like these Howard quips are just like one after another. And Gaston says, he has something to the effect of, if someone kills me, I'm going to avenge my own death. And I will make sure that they pay for it, and I will avenge my own death. So what happens? Well, the innkeeper kills Gaston, the bones come up, they kill the innkeeper, and Kane is... And you do have this really creepy description of how the bones are moving and rattling. But then, here's the sardonic Solomon Kane's like, yes, he avenged his death by cutting loose those chains that freed the Russian wizard skeleton, who ultimately sticks his fingers into the throat of the innkeeper. It's like all the lights go out, and then when he strikes the match again, the hands have penetrated the throat. So it's like, this is Howard in so many stories. It's physical, it's visceral, it's got this sarcastic quips throughout it, and the main character, he's just staying alive.
Right, and sometimes when you would get a popular character like Solomon Kane, I don't feel like writing a Solomon Kane story, but they want a Solomon Kane story. So I'm going to write this story I want, and Solomon Kane will just be in it, or Conan will just be in it, and and the turnaround was so fast that by the time you turned it in, the editor would go, no, you need to make him more. And they're like, shit, we got to go to press tomorrow. There was no, so he had a lot of freedom because of, especially by the time he was popular, he had a lot of freedom to just do what he wanted. And because the turnaround time for the pulp stuff was, it was like a factory. There was no, we're going to take 2 weeks to edit it and gloss it and
I think one of the reasons I tried to note when they were written. So Rattle of Bones is one of the earliest that was on the list, 1929, and really, he passed away in 36. So it was pretty early in his career. But man, you see that theme. It just starts, that becomes the essence of so many of his stories, with this really creepy description of these bones that are, crawling around. You hear the rattle of the chain. Is that a chain? Is that bones? That type of thing. So,
That's
some great stuff.
I think that's just a small part of why his stuff is still so good today in 2021. He didn't get too sidetracked on incredibly accurate descriptions of these creatures, just barely enough to know it's monstrous,
Right.
it's a threat, it's otherworldly, rather than go on and on about what color the scales are and exact
Well,
dimensions.
there's a timelessness too,
Yeah.
because he did create, like, for Conan the Hyporia, or it's not tied to, like,
Mhm.
if you write something set in New York 1936, it feels,
Sorry.
you have to make it feels dated later. These don't, because it's like reading The Hobbit. It's not really, it's its own place. You know, it feels like it's a different universe. So it has that timeless feel to it.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I was thinking of that this morning, of the limited descriptions of some of these creatures and stuff, and it's just beautiful because then you use your own
Yeah, it's an old writer trick. Like, if you're writing a murder, or you're writing someone dying violently, you don't describe all of it. You hit the high points, because the reader is going to fill in the blanks, and they're going to make it worse than anything I can write. Because they're filling in the gory bits. By,
I think one of the things we were going to talk a little bit about was Lovecraft.
Mhm.
Because Lovecraft was on the rise at that point in time too, and this is, to me, just like one of those fantastic dynamics, because you may be aware, Howard and Lovecraft created a correspondence. They wrote back and forth for a period from 1930 to 1936, and there's this influence that goes across. And certainly before that, Lovecraft kind of started, I don't think he was like Lovecraft telling him what to write, but he was reading Lovecraft stuff. And inside of those letters, Howard's like, acknowledges that you're impacting my work as well as the broader work of fiction. So before that period of time, Howard's stuff was very, very physical. Like his first one, Spear and Fang, it's a Cro-Magnon man versus a caveman. They're fighting. A werewolf, but they tend to be very physical monsters or other men, that they're fighting. So it's another person who's strong or powerful. Whereas, as you know, Lovecraft was much more mental. And then Howard wrote The Black Stone.
I was hoping you were going to get that. Yeah.
So Black Stone, which is interesting because, and it's probably one of his more famous. It is pure Lovecraft in concept, okay? Because he pulls the idea of this mystical black stone. It's in Hungary. People who have been around it too much start having nightmares, and they go insane, and all these things. And in case you're really interested, someone did pull together a book that is Howard's Cthulhu mythos stories alone. So it's only the ones that kind of have that type of theme to them. And just like Lovecraft made up the Necronomicon in some of these books, Howard made up his own, right? Von Youtt's Nameless Cults. And so they even called it the Nameless Cults here. But in the Black Stone, I didn't bring my glasses, so I'm not even sure I can read this. But, and I hate to just read this, but this description, I love so much, because it's, even though Howard says this story, in retrospect, Howard says, this story was clearly, like a ripoff of your stories. I think that it really stands out. So this is the Black Stone's there. He comes up and he sees that they're doing all these people are dancing around. They're sacrificing at this. It's physical sacrifice. There's a woman that they're beating with a switch till she's bloody. You don't see that in Lovecraft. It's very physical, and that's what they're using to summon this god up. And here's the description: a huge, monstrous toad-like thing squatted on the top of the monolith. So you got the stone, and it appears up there. The only thing he focuses on is the eyes. It's huge, blinking eyes, which reflected all of the lust, abysmal greed, obscene cruelty, and monstrous evil that has stalked the sons of men since their ancestors moved blind and hairless from the tree trunks, or treetops. In those grisly eyes were mirrored all the unholy and vile secrets that sleep in the cities under the sea, and their skulk from the light of the day and the blackness of the primordial caverns. So I just, man, those words just echo, because I'm like, Lovecraft doesn't describe, he loves to describe and I love reading his stories as well, but the mental and how it's, the cosmic and all this, Howard takes this very concept and, man, he makes it physical. This thing is filled with all the lust and evil and, physical things that men do. You see it in his eyes, right?
And
that's the only description you
paint
get.
a good mental picture though, because like I'm filling in the details of it's not what it looks like on the because you can see it and he's able to get you there, get you you're almost in the room with it, Yeah. And whereas Lovecraft, you're in his brain.
Oh yeah.
And and I think sometimes with Lovecraft to get you so into that, that you almost feel like a little weird that thinking about what they're thinking about because it was so because some of his creatures were really disturbing.
Yeah, and I think the Lovecraft, typically they're first person, and so you're in the mind of this person. Not all, but most of them, they go into madness. Drives them insane. And when Howard starts to deal with these things, now this is his first one, the first entry into that Lovecraft. As it progresses, though, he creates a physical response. Instead of weakening and collapsing under the madness, Howard's characters buckle down, they dig deep, and they're going to fight whatever it is. And the character in here, he is haunted by dreams, but he carries on. He doesn't go insane and kill himself or go into insane asylum. He moves on in life, even though he's haunted by these dreams of what he has seen at that moment.
Well, I think that's a good. A lot of writers do that too. I love mixing genres and mixing types of stories, and he certainly has. Took his an action story, and marries this horror to it. And I think you get something that, even though it's inspired by Lovecraft, you get something that is uniquely Robert E. Howard by the way he writes it.
Right. Robert E. Howard had so much of that creatures and so forth that time forgot, that was beyond our ages and so forth, and may still be in our own earth and
the hollow earth stuff.
And a different than what you're saying, the cosmic, parallels. And so I thought that was really interesting. Do you know? I was going to ask. Do you know? So isn't there a Bran Mak Morn story about a black stone, the one where it's in the lake, right? It's thrown in the lake.
So Worms of the Earth,
right?
It's probably one of his most famous non-Conan stories, and it is creepy as all get out. And Bran Mak Morn, he's leader of the Picts. The Romans have invaded up into Britain, and they kill one of his subjects. And he wants vengeance. And so, again, if you've read it, I hate to repeat all these things, but man, it's chock full of some great stuff. So, Bran Mak Morn, he's king, he's this eternal character. He goes to the witch of the lake, a were-witch, and he says, I want to contact the worms of the earth. And she's like, you're trying to do something that no man wants to do. There's no way you want to bring them up. I want vengeance. She says, it's going to cost you. And he's like, hey, here's some gold. Here's this, here's that. No, it's one night together. That's the witch's requirement. Sound familiar? Conan the Barbarian. That scene in Conan the Barbarian is lifted straight out. She's a mottled, skin color, and she's haggard, and she's like, no one will ever touch me like a lover. And so, but for one night, and I'm going to carry this the rest of my life, I want the passion of a king. And so he does, and then she points him to where this ancient race that was an enemy of the Picts, where they dwell. He goes there, he steals their black stone. So they have an altar the black stone shows up in a lot of stories. And he steals it, takes it to a lake, throws it into the lake, and so then obviously these creatures who tunnel under the earth, you can hear them squircling under there and everything else. They know he has it, but they don't know where he put it. Now there's a little bit of logic problem there, but they can figure out where he's at. His horse is, there's been disturbances around his horse and things. So he makes a deal with them. I'll give you your black stone back. You get the Roman commander out of this impregnable stone tower, Trojan tower. Oh, Trojan doesn't sound right because it's a Trojan horse, but it's close to that. But it's impregnable tower. You get him out of there, bring him, and then I'm going to fight him one-on-one. And so
Roman, were they Roman?
Roman,
they were Roman.
Romans, yeah.
First memory is Bran Mak Morn, right? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
It's set in real history.
Yes.
Because you got Romans,
Yes.
but it has supernatural elements in our reality. That's the setting for him. Okay.
Which was not that uncommon for Howard's historical.
No, it's not. He
Especially the older, David stuff.
yeah.
But Conan and Cole were, a fictionalized universe.
Well, it's supposed to be our prehistory.
Prehistory.
Right, but
where
yeah.
you have much more freedom.
Yeah, because he like Hyboria, it could be anything you need it to be.
Yeah, right.
And yeah.
But he did. I do find it interesting because just the idea of his mind, because he does create this history that spans the prehistory, which is that Hyborian age, but then carries forward. But he's consistent across many stories, because there's some of the later stories where you deal with racial memories, and it'll go back into a Hyborian age and some of the things that were happening, all these different pieces. So in his mind, he creates this world history that is based on this reality back to a point, and then this lost Atlantis and other kingdoms and things at that point in time where those were myths and things that people could have been, right? But what always amazes me, it's not like that's just consistent in the Conan stories. It becomes consistent across all of his stories, all of his views and stories that he tells on other things too. To where Cole is summoned up into one of the battles.
Yes.
Inside a whole nother story, and you get these literally crossovers of his stories, like years later at different points in time on the timeline that are consistent.
Is it The Last King?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, that was very cool. And at first I didn't understand if it was, is it his spirits, that is here, and somehow through the shaman magic, the old shaman magic, or is it really him? And he didn't even, and I thought that the writing of that was really interesting, and even he's confused, how am I here?
So then you get a little distracted there. The worms of the earth. Not only do you have these again, they don't give a tight description of what it is. It's in your mind. But they tunnel around under the earth. They come to the tower. They upheave the entire thing. Bran Mak Morn's thinking they're going to grab the leader, and I that's all I want. But they've obliterated the entire castle, the keep, everything about it. People are dead everywhere. He's unleashed this thing to get revenge that's impacting all of them. So he comes back, he brings the stone. There's actually a demon living at the bottom of that lake.
Yeah.
He doesn't fight it. He senses its presence. He swims down, he gets the lake, he gets the stone, and he gets the hell out. And he knows there's a presence, but he doesn't actually, again, it's great because he doesn't, what does it add for him to have fought whatever it is that's down there? It's just on this thing. The worms bring in the Roman leader, and he's gone completely insane. So there's no, Morn wants to fight him, but because of what he's seen with the worms and the creatures and experienced and all this, he's completely lost every aspect of humanity. And Bran Mak Morn, in a act of mercy, just kills him. And so so cool. So cool.
And the beauty of that story is, had he written it from the other perspective, he's the bad guy.
Yeah.
This, but because it's this revenge, we're following him, and he's our point of view character. But yeah, had he written it from the king's perspective, the king, where the king thinks he's the good, it's just good stuff. It's and there is a lot of fun in writing those kind of bad guy characters, or those morally challenged characters, I guess is a good way to put it. But, yeah.
Getting back to Lovecraft for a second, are there any specific crossovers of Howard and a Lovecraft character, or or is it just influence?
So there are specific books. So you'll get mentions of books. Both of them use each other's books and names of Cthulhu and Ryloth. I think Ryloth is used across both of them, and I'm pretty sure.
And was whoever wrote it first, or is the second person using that name? Is he saying it's the same character, or they're just using the name? No, it's the same. Yeah, they're using it in the same context, and they encourage each other to do that. So they talk about it in their letters. So it's kind of like one of the early Marvel team-ups or something,
Yeah.
Well, Lovecraft did that a lot, and not just with Howard. I mean, Clark Ashton Smith, a young Robert Bloch, yeah.
So one of them that I mentioned, and it's a really interesting story, and I didn't prep Ted to bring that in, but there is a round robin story that was written. Okay, and just step back for a minute and think of this. Julius Schwartz, who would later become the DC person, ran a fanzine at that point in time, fantasy fan, and he did a round robin story. Okay, with C.L. Moore, Frank Bellenkamp, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard. And they took the story and they passed it around. Okay, I mean, you can't make this up. And so the story begins with the camper. He finds this mysterious crystal cube, and he's been searching for it. And it's kind of unknown. That's the first chapter. And the second by one author, and the second chapter by the second author. The third chapter is Lovecraft, right? And so in the Lovecraft portion of this story, the mind of the finder gets pulled in, and he goes to this other world where these incredible centipede worm creatures exist. And he's trapped there, and he's blacking in and out. And Lovecraft writes this huge cosmic history of these creatures who plant these mental teleportation seeds across the universe, and they pull consciousnesses across the universe and all this. And finally, the guy, as he wakes up and he sees this creature, he blacks out, because it's so overwhelming, it's so horrible, and all this. So the next chapter is Howard. And Howard writes, he wakes up and basically the guy says, I've had enough of this, and he grabs a crystal, he kills the dude, and then he becomes aware of how the planet is being controlled. He goes to the high priest, kills the high priest, takes control, and he begins ruling the planet of all these creatures, because he's got a human spirit inside, and he finds out they put the spirit in the body of this alien creature, and he comes in because he's got a human spirit that fights. He overcomes and becomes the ruler of this planet, and it's just like, how do you, as pure Lovecraft, he goes insane, passes out, he wakes up, and he's like, hell with this, and I'm gonna beat the crap out of him. and then it's followed up by another chapter, which is really actually pretty fascinating, because it tells you what happens to the human body that gets the worm brain, or the worm spirit put in it. It can't function. It can't figure out how to use this body. It crawls over, falls into a lake, and drowns. And a hunter comes by and finds him. Right. In the meantime, George Campbell. That's the name of the main character. C.L. Moore, Merritt, and Frank Bellenkamp in the meantime, he becomes the most wise and benevolent ruler for that whole planet that they've ever known. And that's kind of how it all ends, so.
Was it the first example of a jam like of that type of nature?
I don't know. I mean,
I've seen jams done in comics.
And that was in 19, I didn't write it down. It's in the story because
Yeah.
it crosses over.
Interesting.
What's it called?
The Challenge from Beyond. And again, it's like, 10 pages long. It was published in 1935. September issue of the Fantasy magazine. And it does say he did that with a couple of other stories as well. That they would do it, they pass it around, which is something writers love to do.
Yeah, because you would challenge it, like end your chapter on some kind of cliffhanger.
Right.
Yeah.
For the next writer to have to pick up that cliffhanger and, yeah.
It's funny, I recently reread Naked Kane the Stranger. Are y'all familiar with Naked Kane the Stranger? Where it's 60s fake novel, essentially kind of making fun of the industry of what trash they'll publish.
Okay.
But it's this erotica novel, but it came out later. Penelope Ash was not really the author. It was really like 13 or 14 authors from a newspaper. I can't remember, not USA Today, but it was a newspaper at the time. And they played together very well as far as, sticking to, okay, this is what we're going to do in our story. But that's funny that each of those authors really just veered like, no, it like the improv rules of yes and they were like, no, but he.
Well, like I said, with like, especially in that era with like the way that writers were using pen names and house names so often, you could play with stuff like that. Like, you could write something that you wouldn't normally be thought of, Like if Robert E. Howard wanted to write a romance pulp, he could have done that under a pen name nobody would ever know, but he could have got that out of his, I want to write that. And the modern day equivalent is romance novels or erotica. I know several people that are like, I write science fiction and fantasy under my real name, and I do okay. I write erotica under a pen name and pay my mortgage. So.
And ultimately, Howard really, he father of sword and sorcery, truly the term, but he ultimately wanted to be a Western writer.
Yeah.
His passion was the history of the Old West. That's what he really wanted. And so, he did. He wrote a number of Westerns, but he couldn't get them, he couldn't make the money with it, so that was one of the struggles, but that's probably where he would have migrated to if they.
And sometimes you do those things for the money, so you can do the thing you're passionate about, because, that's like, put it in a movie bar, these guys do these big blockbuster movies to make enough money to make this indie movie they've been wanting to make.
Do you guys, we obviously, I worked at a bookstore for quite a while and over the years, and I saw, there's a huge, I don't know how huge it is, but there's a very interesting market for Western paperbacks today. I don't know if it's as strong as it used to be, but in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was really strong. Was it do you know for sure, or not, I'm just curious, if the pulp Westerns were as popular, or was the Savage and Shadow and the Weird Tales dominant in the pulp era?
During the pulp era,
Or is everything just equal balance?
I think it was pretty, what survived from the pulp era was things like the sword and sorcery or the hero pulps, the Doc Savages, that's the stuff that survived the longest. But then again, probably the longest running pulp series was a series about trains. It was pulp train stories. And it was, each book had, it wasn't even the same characters, it was just like, it's a story selling a train. And that ran for decades. So the pulp era had a lot of different stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think after that's kind of when Westerns here started falling off a little bit. You had just your core people writing Westerns, the people that
But I think
The only reason I ask, here's the reason I ask, because if the Westerns, in the world of pulps, in their heyday, if the biggest genre was Westerns, I'm surprised Howard if it's that big and popular, they would need more writers, and I'm surprised that Howard had to slum over here and do other things. Why could he just do his westerns and be in demand for it?
What I suspect is, he started doing the weird stuff. I think genuinely he really liked weird stuff. And a lot of his influence was people telling, he loved the people telling stories. And he had a lot of horror stories told to him as a child. He does talk about that in some of his letters. And so when he tells some of those stories, it's like he's telling these, the story that's been told to him. I guess I kind of understood that, like, some of the adventure, boxing, fighting stories, fighting pulps, boxing, stuff like that, actually had a broader readership than what Weird Tales did.
But yeah, by the 50s they started.
Yeah.
Those
Right.
started
I was saying, if Howard's passion was westerns, and if the westerns were plentiful, you would think they would need writers, and he could just.
I don't think it was. He writes about that, but I think that was kind of later as he, kind of burned through. In my mind, he kind of burned through a lot of the fantasy, getting all that out, because even he will talk about he just grew tired of Conan and wanted to do something else. He grows tired of Bran Mak Morn, and he will say, I don't know that I have any more stories of them in there.
There is, throughout history, there are tales of writers who go, I want to try something different.
Well, Conan Doyle kills off Holmes at one point,
but
and then I was thinking about there's some other character that writers, they just Fleming, he was not ready to cut off Bond.
But the problem is you get the publishers that go, no,
yeah,
nobody will read your Western. You are a sword and sorcery fantasy writer. Nobody.
Just like film directors or comic book writers are always paid for their.
This is what your audience wants. They get in that mindset of, if we let him write something different, he might alienate that audience, or and most of the time that's not true. Yeah, it may not carry over all the audience, but we've seen multiple things over the years where writers do that under a pen name, and it's popular. And then once the publisher goes, oh, it's popular, now we'll put their real name on it, to let people know. Like Michael Crichton, who writes all these big blockbuster novels, he wrote under the name John Lane, writing men's adventure pulp fiction in the 60s and 70s. Because that's what he wanted to do, but they wouldn't let him because he was writing things like the Andromeda Strain. They're like, you can't. They won't read this pulpy heist book.
Don't cross the streets.
Yeah.
But I'll say this: if you look at the shelf of his published, it always astounds me because there's 4 volumes of his boxing stories. 4 full volumes. There's more boxing stories than are Conan or any of those. It's just those haven't carried. People never latched on to Steve Costigan as this bruiser and fighter. His Western stories, he had a lot of them published. So, he was able to get into some of those markets, but I think he had seen so much success, and really they were kind of working from different, Farnsworth as the Weird Tales publisher, he was kind of his own thing, but I think as he started to mature somewhat as a writer, but he did get a lot of those. Someone was Western, I can't remember who it was that wanted to talk a little bit about weird Westerns.
Oh yeah.
Because he does several weird Westerns where there's a vampire and a ghost and different things that show up. But I have always been amazed once I discovered that. It was a number of years. But you have Oriental stories, you have adventure stories, you have a host of things. Conan was 17 of 300 published stories. Conan endures, and Bran Mak Morn, but even those, there's only a handful of stories. He had hundreds of published stories that went way outside of that.
And in the heyday of the pulps, it was there were the character-based things, but again, there were most of the pulps were not character series, but genre series. There's travel pulps, or sports pulp, boxing pulps, romance pulps. The Harlequin basically come out of that. So they had a lot of those where each book was a different set of characters, but it was the genre that was carrying on. Like I said, 2 decades of train stories, a monthly train novel. you know, it's just amazing what they can do. And I mean,
Just about out of time.
Yeah,
so-
I was just gonna say, while he did have some westerns published, it may have also just been a hard, his particular brand of westerns may have been a hard sell. One of my absolute favorite Howard stories is Vultures of Wappington. And that is, in those 30 pages, that is essentially a spaghetti western 3 decades before that term was invented. I mean, if people wanted more black and white stuff, and you know, he's adapting from like more the noir tradition of, you know, the very shady protagonist, and that may not have been the sort of thing that a lot of Western pulp publishers may have wanted.
yeah, and there we are looking at this too from the lens of time, where like you know, we talked about this with the Buck Revenge. It was a flop when it came out, but now it's a beloved cult classic, and even though he had some success with some of these, like the boxing stuff, it wasn't as far reaching at the time, you know, but now, because we've come to love Howard, and Howard's got this place in history, people are going back and discovering that stuff that they may not have before.
Well, great discussion. Thank you so much for contributing so many great
And
questions.
we stayed on topic.
And amazing.
Oh, yeah.
That's the first.
Is that
We got a few monsters in too.
Yeah,
exactly. You know, we had the long list. but
And
it was good.
there's so much more. I'm so excited to finally come to reading Robert E. Howard stuff. I can't wait to dive in even more over the next year, and maybe even have another panel to be able to talk even more and more about it.
I have nothing to do with Robert E. Howard Foundation. Okay, so if you go online, look up Robert E. Howard Foundation. But they are committed to publishing every single word Howard wrote, and they have published. When I say there's 4 volumes of fight stories, they published those, and they're in their complete original format. His spicy stories, his weird Orient boxing stories. The volume of stuff is a whole shelf, and they put it in beautiful print. They have some great covers. They only print like 200 at a time because there's no demand for
Or
them.
they
If
give it
you
a
have
print,
any interest in them, go on the site and you can either order what they have in stock, or when they release, they do another run, you can get those up. And you know, that's where you find his letters, his grade school essays. They've got a volume that's got all his stuff that remains that he wrote in school. If you're really interested in seeing some of that, you know, stuff that you're not going to see, you know, in a mainstream publisher, they're only doing it because they love it and they want it out.
I do wonder what these guys like Frank Burroughs and Howard, the guys that grew up in this, or they were writing this era, again, when they were writing what was considered a lot of throwaway material, I wonder what they would think if they could see the future, that the fact that people are that there's a great love for this stuff and people are doing everything they can to protect it. I wonder how, you know, that they didn't get to feel that when they were alive, that it was just something people read the way, you know, but it was, you know, it would be cool to see, you know, what their reaction would be if they could have seen the future.
I know,
That's for sure.
And,
yeah, a shame that he took his life so young and too early, but left us such a treasure trove of great writing. Before we close here, would you tell our audience where they could find you and interact with you?
I have a table out here in the dealer's room. I am next to Spook Show. What's his name? Bring the other name. Professor Morgan. Shane, thank you. Spook Show next to him. I have another panel. I have a panel at 1, and I have a panel at 2:30. We're back in here at 2:30, and then other than that, I'll be out there.
All right. I'll be out there as well, right next to Mark Maddox. You probably already see me there. I'm online on Instagram as DDT Books. I think that's where you can find me.
Wonderful, great. And again, I'm Kyle Mitchell. I'm the second director here for the media track and also helping out with the lit part of the lit track. If you're interested in finding my stuff, you can find me at Poet Kyle online, and I do have 2 books of poetry online. Once again, a hand for these guys.